Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the class of COVID-19, the Future for Education session at Tolpuddle 2020. My name is Hannah Packham. I'm the Southwest Regional Secretary for the National Education Union. It is a huge honour to chair this session on the future of education at Tolpuddle this year, and I would just like to thank the Southwest TUC team for ensuring that we can all be together this weekend, albeit virtually and not in the Tolpuddle field. So thank you to the team. So viewers on Zoom can make comments and introduce themselves on the chat function at the bottom of the screen. And there's also the Festival Code of Conduct also in the screen, in the chat, that I would draw your attention to. The session is being recorded, and the session's also being live streamed to a really wide, fantastic audience on Facebook and YouTube. So as we draw to the end of this academic year, we can reflect on what has been an unprecedented year for education, for educational professionals, for pupils, parents and carers. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from the panel and from our audience on the future of education, the challenges and the opportunities. So it gives me great pleasure to be joined today by such a fantastic panel. We have Patrick Roach, NASUWT General Secretary. Hi, Patrick. Gemma from More Than a Score, Gemma Hayley. Kate Green, MP, Shadow Education Minister. Mary Bousted, NEU Joint General Secretary. And Joe Grady, UCU General Secretary. So welcome, panel. It's fantastic for you to join us all. So each of the panel will have 5 minutes in which to speak, and this will be followed by a question and answer session. So I'd encourage everyone to get your questions in, and they can be put on the question and answer function at the bottom of the screen. I will be firm on speaking time to allow as much time as possible for questions and answers, and it may not be that every member of the panel will have an opportunity to answer every question, but we'll certainly, I'm sure we'll get excellent responses to your questions. So without further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Patrick Roach, NASUWT General Secretary. Dr. Patrick Roach is General Secretary of the NASUWT. Patrick was appointed as General Secretary in April 2020, having previously served as Deputy General Secretary for 10 years. So welcome, Patrick. Thank you. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Hannah, and good afternoon to everyone here for, I think, this extremely important event. I mean, colleagues, as Hannah said, this has been a pretty momentous year for education. We know that education matters, and that education is the best weapon against prejudice, bigotry, and in the fight against poverty. In our schools, and our teachers are at the heart of that fight for equality and social justice. So it really has been a challenging few months as our schools have been closed. Challenging also because of the government's failure to plan for a virus that, frankly, the world saw coming. Instead, teachers had to step up and put in place creative solutions to support children and young people. And teachers, head teachers and support staff in schools, frankly, have done an amazing job throughout this crisis, and they'll continue to do so because it's what they do, and they deserve praise, not criticism. But we all know, colleagues, that teachers alone can't deliver the education recovery that our children need. We also need government to step up. Following endless U-turns, the government's now announced that all schools will be open fully to every child from the 1st of September. They've published yet more guidance. And whilst the vast majority of teachers, around 86%, say that the government's guidance is lacking, what teachers really want is a plan. They want a plan with resources that will ensure that all schools can reopen fully, and so that teachers can educate children in safety. But we still don't have that plan, colleagues, putting at risk children's education next term, next year and beyond. Because anyone can see that you can't just snap your fingers and reopen schools in the middle of a pandemic. You need a plan that's backed up with the additional resources that schools are going to need. And you need a government that will put itself on the line and explain to parents and to the public how it will ensure that children and staff are kept safe. Now, we know that our children have lost out on opportunity during this pandemic. They've missed out educationally, they've lost out socially and physically, and emotionally as well. Our children have endured anxiety, pain, and yet more loss. But colleagues, the answer to securing recovery for our children isn't to threaten their parents with penalty fines if their children are not back in school on the 1st of September. Instead, we need a plan to win the trust and confidence of parents and carers. And yes, if we are to deliver the best for the class of COVID-19, we need to give children the opportunity to catch up on their learning. But our children need much, much more than catch-up tuition. We also need a plan that recognises that the emotional well-being of children is key to enabling all children to reconnect with education, because children are going to need emotional support, not to be put under pressure of yet more tests designed to feed a divisive and, I have to say, a regressive system of league tables. And we don't need a plan which subjects schools to an unfair, high-stakes system of accountability and that scapegoats teachers who are working tirelessly to support those children who've been hardest hit during this pandemic. And colleagues, we need a plan that recognises that our children are living through a triple crisis. The coronavirus pandemic, of course, but also a deep economic crisis, and also, may I say, institutional and systemic racism, as attested by the disproportionate impact of this pandemic and the Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the continued impact of institutional racism and racial injustice. Colleagues, we need a national plan in response to those issues as well, underpinning the way in which schools open and the future of education. And if all children are to recover, we're going to need a plan of action on poverty. We need action, colleagues, not apologies, for investing more in those schools and in those communities, serving children and young people in the most disadvantaged areas of the country. We know that many children living in poverty are also living in households where at least one adult is working. So while we're at it, and for the sake of the class of COVID-19, we need a plan to end 0 hours contracts, precarious employment, low pay, including a plan to actually improve the chances for supply teachers working in schools. We need a plan to end inequality, where a child's access to education is based on their parents' ability to pay. For the sake of the class of COVID-19, I would say we need a national plan for education recovery, a new deal for children and young people. And if we're serious in applauding the efforts of teachers who play such a vital role in our children's futures, we also need a new deal for teachers too, a deal to end the real terms pay cuts and to deliver a pay award for all teachers this summer, which can help to restore teacher morale and halt the crisis in teacher retention. Because now, colleagues, now is the time for bold measures to benefit not only today's children, but also the generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you. Our next speaker is Gemma Hayley from More Than a Score. Gemma's a parent and campaigner, and More Than a Score is a campaigning group that wants to change the way that pupils are assessed and routinely tested and how schools are judged. So thank you, Gemma.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. So I just wanted to start very quickly, just summing up a little bit about who we are. We're a coalition of parent groups, including the National Education Union, also academics and experts working in the field, as well as a near 200 strong national spread of local parent organisers and actively supportive head teachers. We campaign to change the way young children are formally assessed and the way schools are held accountable through high pressure government tests that take place all the way through primary school. In fact, currently 5 out of 7 years of primary school. We are the go-to organisation for media and others when it comes to comment on the current deeply flawed system. I have to say we're not against low pressure teacher-led assessment, and we are not against holding schools to account. What do? Well, on the ground, our tactics range from cross-party political lobbying. We enjoy support from all the main opposition parties, to activating grassroots support and staging imaginative campaign bursts that win high levels of media attention. I don't know if you're aware of our March of the 4-year-olds last year, where we took 200 4-year-olds to Westminster, and 3 of them, including my youngest, handed in a petition to 10 Downing Street against reception baseline. Currently, in the light of COVID, we celebrated a recent win with Drop Baseline 2020. This was an intensive virtual campaign over the last 3 months, including a barrage of mini films, mainstream media coverage and letter writing to MPs. Happily, this resulted in the Department for Education cancelling their planned introduction of baseline tests in English and maths for all 4-year-olds when they first start school this September. Alongside grassroots and political lobbying work, we've also been massively building the case against the current primary testing system, and we've done this through research with heads and parents. We want to pull apart the mirage conjured by this government that parents use these test results to weigh up schools or to check the progress of their children. We also want to pull apart the mirage that making every child in this country sit high pressure tests is an effective way of holding schools to account. It simply is not. Our independent YouGov research with heads shows how near unanimously unhappy they are with the current system. So to give you some headline stats, 93% of head teachers think the government should change the current primary system, school testing system. 94% think SATs put children under way too much pressure, and 93% think these tests are the wrong way to show what pupils can do. So, listening closely to head teachers, teachers and parents, we see an isolated government pushing ahead with SATs and other formal tests in the coming school year in the face of mass public, professional and expert opposition. Our recent YouGov research with parents, released earlier this month, shows that over 3/4 of parents think the prospect of taking SATs and other government tests will add to the stress of children in the new school year. Only 8% consider preparing for government tests to be important this coming year. Only 1 in 10 parents were bothered about their children missing SATs and other formal tests this year. With children having missed almost half a year of schooling, and with many of them having suffered hunger, trauma, even bereavement, we know that parents want safety, mental health, and an enjoyable, rich, rounded curriculum to be the top priority at school. We know that they want their children to catch up properly and to re-fall in love with learning, not to have to cram away at narrow catch-up curriculum geared towards passing government tests in English and maths. And we know that head teachers and teachers want that too. Just this week, the government announced that Year 2 children will have to sit the phonics screening check in the autumn term. This was cancelled along with other tests in the summer term, but this means now that Year 2 pupils, so that's 6 and 7-year-olds, will be going back to school to face a test in the first term back. If they don't meet the expected standard, they will have to resit that test in the summer, and they will have to take their Key Stage 1 SATs that term. So that's 3 lots of tests for 6 and 7-year-olds in the year following a pandemic. That really is not putting children's well-being first. This is why we have launched our Drop SATs 2021 campaign, working closely over the last 2 weeks with heads and parents and soon MPs. We have had coverage on national radio and, would you believe, even in the Telegraph. This is a winnable campaign. We know we can win this. So please, please throw your support behind it. In the first instance, you can share all of our Drop SATs 2021 material. You can find it on all of our social media channels. We are on Facebook, we are on Twitter, and we are on Instagram. And secondly, please sign and share our petition at morethanascore.uk. Morethanascore.org.uk. Sign and share our petition at morethanascore.org.uk. And watch this space come September. Thank you.
Thank you, Gemma. It's wonderful to hear about all your campaigning. It's fantastic, really inspiring.
Thank you.
Our next speaker is Kate Green MP, Shadow Education Minister. Thank you for joining us, Kate. Kate was elected MP for Stretford and Urmston in May 2010. Prior to her election, Kate was Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, and before that, Director of the National Council for One-Parent Families. Kate has been the Shadow Secretary of State for Education since June 2020. Welcome, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you ever so much, Hannah. I really am the new girl in the class. I've been doing the job for 3 weeks today, and you can imagine it's quite scary when the rest of the class clearly know how things work, and I'm having to pretend confidently that I do, while still trying to get my head around what is a vast and crucial brief. Nothing is more important to me than the life chances of our children and young people and the benefit that lifelong learning can bring to all of us. And so I really have enjoyed listening to both Gemma and Patrick so far in what they've said, and there is so much that I find myself in agreement with. Clearly, the priority over this summer is for children's return to class and the return of students in September, the preparations to be made for that. Can I start by saying I think it's outrageous of the government 2.5 weeks before the end of term to dump a whole load of guidance on heads and principals and then expect people who are exhausted, who've been working flat out since February to cope with educating children and young people in a vastly unpredicted context, to put those plans in place at a time when they desperately need a break and a rest to get ready for the new term. I know that staff will rise to that challenge, but it is typical of this government to put out a whole lot of grand instructions and then back away and leave it to people in the front line to fill in all the detail. And it's a great tribute to the education professionals that I know that they're working so hard to make that work, but it is a disgraceful way to treat people. And I think, as Patrick has suggested, we're going to see more of that, random guidance coming out, instructions without proper detail about how they can be put in place in practice. But the priority is to bring people back into the classroom safely in September. And not only has there not been the time to prepare properly for that, there also haven't been sufficient resources put in place. We know, for example, that the childcare sector is under tremendous pressure, with 1 in 4 childcare providers suggesting they may not last another 12 months. We know that in schools, the Head Teachers Round Table have said that the funding that has been provided to meet the extra costs of the return simply are not sufficient. FE has struggled for years with underfunding. Late in the day, Gavin Williamson appears to have noticed this without apparently acknowledging that for the last 10 years it's been his party that have been in charge, and this underfunding has not happened by accident. And his attack in the last few days, along with Michelle Donnellan's attack on universities, has absolutely astonished me. We face the prospect of 13 universities failing altogether as a result of this crisis. And I am just astonished to hear a Secretary of State for Education and a universities minister presenting the answer to that conundrum as being that fewer students should go to university. I don't think I've ever met before an education minister who wanted fewer students rather than more students. It's amazing. So we need students back in the classroom, because learning is important, and particularly important now as we face such an uncertain future. It's always important for people to be able to learn to fulfill their full potential, to address the issues of poverty and inequality that Patrick rightly pointed to. It's important for our economy that we are educating people to meet the demands of the jobs of the future, but that's not the only reason for education. It enriches all of our lives, and that's one of the reasons why I believe so passionately in lifelong learning. But learning will have to sit alongside the provision of the emotional support that staff and students are going to need on return to the classroom in September. This has been an unsettling time for everyone, a traumatizing time for some, and that emotional support can't be underplayed or discounted when we plan the return to class after the summer. Of course, I would say emotional support is provided in part by high quality structured learning. And you can see already when children are in school and the work that's being done with them by teachers and support staff, just how very happy they are to be there. I've had some wonderful visits in the last 3 weeks since I took on this role, and the professionalism of the staff, the welcome that children and young people are receiving as they come back to class, and the way in which you can see it's immediately raising their sense of pride, their sense of confidence, and their quality of life is absolutely uplifting to see, and just a tribute to the great professionalism of the education sector. And in fact, I don't think I've ever known a time when respect for teachers has been so high. I'm the daughter of two, and they spent their entire professional lives complaining about the opinions of non-experts and the way in which their professionalism was belittled. I think we're in a very interesting place at the moment where the public have really come to appreciate the professionalism that teachers and lecturers and support staff bring to bear. And that's a great opportunity for us, I think, to take on a journey with us how education will need to change and be different in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. And it certainly will need to be different. We're going to have to prepare for a new world with very different kinds of employment patterns, different kinds of jobs, and a real threat to people's employment prospects. So we're going to have to look at equipping people with the skills that give them the best possible chances in a very different labour market, and not just immediately, in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, but looking into the longer term. We're going to have to work in different ways. Already you can see that beginning to happen, whether that's in terms of blended and digital learning, whether it's, as Gemma points out, different kinds of approaches to assessment or to inspection. And we're also going to have to think about the broader context, as Patrick rightly said. We can't expect education to solve all the social ills that so disadvantage certain of our children and young people and adult learners, unless we are prepared to imagine a world in which we are proactively addressing poverty, inequality, and injustice, both in the way in which we resource our education settings and in the way in which we resource families and individuals, ensure that they have adequate incomes, decent homes, health and well-being to make the most of their learning. Then education, schools and colleges can do so much, but they can't do everything. It's not the job of the schools and colleges to undo the social injustice that sits beneath a poverty when it comes to learning. So I'm immensely excited about coming into this brief at this time. It could not be a more challenging and difficult moment. But I know that in working with trade unionists, education professionals, we all share one goal, and that is to offer the best, the most high quality, the most enriching educational experience that we can to everyone, to our children and young people, and throughout our lives. And it's a great chance, I think, for us to be creative, imaginative, original, and radical. And I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that with all of you.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you for that. It's really interesting, and already there's loads of questions coming in. So it's fantastic to see so many questions and so many comments in the chat, literally all over the country. So I'm really pleased that we've got so many people engaging on what the future of education is going to look like. So it's fantastic to have you all with us. So our next speaker is Mary Boustead, NEU Joint General Secretary. So Dr. Mary Boustead is General Secretary of the National Education Union. Mary represents the interests of her members to government and a wide variety of stakeholders. I know that Mary's keen to speak to us all today. So thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Hannah, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm always at Tolpuddle, so I'm feeling very disappointed that I'm not at the Tolpuddle Festival and at the NEU stand and giving away goodies and on the march, but it's great to be here virtually as well. So I think the title is The Future of Education After the COVID Crisis, or I think that's part of the title, is it? And I just want to sort of focus on that, and it follows really from what Kate has said about what sort of education system do we need, and what has COVID really shown, what has the pandemic shown about our education system. And I think the first thing it's shown is that Michael Gove's lie that schools were simply academic hothouses there to get children through exams has shown to be absolutely that, because when schools aren't there, when schools aren't fully open, then we see what part schools play in local communities and in society, ensuring that children are safeguarded, in deprived areas ensuring they're fed, ensuring that their clothes, they've got shoes. When the NEU does surveys with its members after the Christmas holidays, one of the key things we get back from members is holiday hunger, and how many children are coming back looking thinner, looking tired, And you will have noticed last week that the number of children with malnutrition have doubled during the crisis. So the absolutely essential role that schools play as centres of their community, that's really being shown. And the fact that schools are such just centres in their society for parents, for many parents, school is the only place where they can go. And schools fulfil that responsibility. But I'm thinking also about what do we know about our education system. So this is what we know. We have in England an education system which comes third in the international league tables for rote learning. We come behind Uruguay and Ireland, so we come third for rote learning. And what do we know about rote learning? Well, rote learning is really good for lower order skills and knowledge. It's great for times tables. What it's not good at is for the sorts of knowledge which we're going to need, as Kate has been talking about, in our society, where we're going to need, for example, to know about what the risk of the R rate is, what the risk of catching COVID is, what is that risk relative to other risks in your lives. We're going to need in our society to be much better at fake news. A recent study showed that young people find it very difficult to assess the quality of the sources which they read, and that allows fake news to thrive. We know that young people are going to be able to have to synthesize knowledge and generate new knowledge, work well together, to speak well, to present their case and their argument, to understand and to be able to sift evidence. And we know that our education system focus is on timed exams, and as Gemma has said, on testing, means that our education system is good at rote knowledge, but not good at the sorts of knowledge which are going to be needed in the new world that we're all entering now. As Andrea Schleicher, who is the Director General of Education at the OECD, he says, schools need to prepare students for more rapid changes, to train for jobs that haven't been created, to tackle societal changes that have not yet transpired, and to use technologies that have not yet been invented. And they need to prepare students for an interconnected world in which students understand different perspectives and different worldviews and can create a change in society through that understanding. And what do we have? Well, we have a system where children are repeatedly tested in primary, where we have a system of GCSEs and A-levels, which are the tests at secondary, but GCSE put young people through 30 hours of exams in 2 weeks, and which are calculated according to a norm reference system, which means whatever the standards achieved that year, a third of children will fail those exams. They will get less than a level 4 in GCSE, maths and English. And disproportionately, the children who fail will be poor children. They will be working class children. They will be children who are deprived, and black and ethnic minority children also disproportionately fail. So we have an exam mill, and then that is then compounded by an accountability system which is toxic. So the measures, schools must be held accountable for the education they provide, absolutely. But the measures by which they're held accountable actually disproportionately disadvantage schools doing the hardest work in the poorest areas. So we know from the Education Policy Institute study into Boustead that disadvantaged schools, even when they do very well, are highly disproportionate, like to be given special measures or fail their Boustead inspections, whereas schools in the leafy suburbs, even if their value added is dropping rapidly, are still highly likely to get good or outstanding. So we have an accountability system which judges schools on their intake, not on the quality of education they provide. And then that leads to children in those schools finding it much, much harder to get teachers and leaders. It's much more difficult to get qualified teachers and leaders, particularly in STEM subjects, in disadvantaged schools than it is in the leafy suburbs. And that means that the children who need the best teachers most are most likely not to get them. And it also means, Andrea Schleicher talks about teachers can't be treated as widgets on a production line. They feel that they are. They feel that so much, and teachers do more unpaid overtime than any other profession. But when you ask them about the quality of their work, they say so much of the work is done for a toxic accountability system. It's not work that I choose to do, which improves my education for children and young people. And Boustead is at the heart of that. Boustead is the heart of 22% of teachers leaving in 2 years, 40% of teachers leaving within 10 years. And when they're asked why they leave, they talk about the accountability system and they talk about Boustead, and they talk about one bad, unfair judgment ending their career. And that denudes school, it deprives children in the most disadvantaged areas. So what COVID has to tell us, and what we need from a Labour government, is to work with the profession, work with the unions, work with academics, work with researchers, and let's get an education system which is properly accountable, which does improve the life chances of all children, but in particular, the life chances of those 9 out of 30 children in the average class who are poor. And that average will increase by Christmas, where another 300,000 children will be poor. 40% of the attainment gap, and I'll finish with this, Hannah, 40% of the attainment gap between poor children and their more advantaged peers is cemented before they start school. It's cemented through poor housing, through insecure work for their parents, through poor food, through damaged family relationships, because financial insecurity leads to mental insecurity, leads to mental health issues. Some research came out about that today. It's the quality of their life constrains their lives, and the damage is permanent. And 40% of that is done before they start school. And as Kate has said, you cannot expect schools on their own to make up that damage. That has to be for the whole of society. So we need a new education system, and we need a new society. And let's be ambitious now, because why shouldn't we be?
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. Really rousing and inspiring. So our finally, but certainly not least, is Jo Grady, UCU General Secretary. Jo was born in Wakefield in 1984, while her father was part of the UK miners' strike. And Jo joined the University and College Union in 2006 and played a prominent role in UCU's pensions dispute. And in February 2019, Jo was elected as General Secretary of UCU. So thank you for joining us, Jo.
Thank you. And yeah, thanks to everyone for such amazing speeches already. It's so great that these events are happening online whilst we can't gather together. I guess I should really start with the challenges that are facing post-16 education and really just outline how huge they are. Further education has been systematically underfunded for decades. It was really worrying to see Williamson and his efforts last week to sound like a friend to our colleges, and how shocked and appalled he was by the badly funded state of further education, when it is his party who have been systematically underfunding it. And I think that, you know, anybody who works in FE would have been pretty appalled. Higher education, again, has been subject to cuts. Right now, we are facing a projected 2.5 billion shortfall in funding that could see 30,000 jobs lost from the HE sector, and a further 32,000 from the economy as a whole. So we're looking at potentially 62,000 jobs. And I think it's fair to say that the Tories, especially with regards FE, skills, adult ed, they have decimated these sectors. So to sort of come forward now and say that we need to look at how HE needs to be reformed to fund FE, this is not a zero-sum game. We have to really ensure that we resist this narrative and push back against it. And that's precisely what we are doing right now in UCU. Because what we are looking at the minute is a time when the government should be encouraging all people to engage in all types of education that's available to them, and not denigrate it, which is precisely what we are seeing, particularly with universities, but with the whole gambit of post-16 education. Now, the battle lines, if you like, they were already drawn. And I think this is the case across many sectors. And what we've seen is that COVID has really exposed a lot of what we already knew was rotten, whether that was about our kind of social justice system or education systems. And this is particularly the case in FE and HE. So you cannot have failed to have noticed the vast amounts of industrial action taken by UCU members in the last 12 months. And that's in both FE and HE. Precarity is endemic. 30% of HE institutions use 0-hour contracts. 46% of all teaching-only staff in HE are employed on a fixed-term contract. 40% of those are hourly paid. And precarity, of course, is compounded by low pay and other types of structural discrimination. So it isn't just the case that if you are a woman or if you're black or any other kind of minority ethnic member of staff, you're paid less. I mean, you are, but you're also much more likely, and in some cases twice as likely, to be on a fixed term contract, to be on an hourly paid or 0 hours contract. So precarity, low pay, different forms of institutional discrimination, they all compound one another. And as I say, this was a battle line that was drawn before COVID lockdown, and it's something that we are seeing as we've moved through these months. And it's worth pointing out that, this is not a cost-cutting exercise, for making ends meet for cash-strapped institutions, because precarious employment, particularly in HE, where it's most prevalent, is most prevalent in the really wealthy institutions, in those Russell Group institutions that have been around for decades and often longer. And again, it's prevalent in Oxbridge, who have absolutely no excuse. Because what's happening here is this is a business model, and a business model that the whole sector has pursued aggressively. And what I would like to say sort of before I wrap up is that education workers have not accepted that it has to be this way. The students in post-16 have not accepted that it has to be this way. I think UCU members have probably uniquely, unlike any other striking worker in the last 12 to 24 months, had their students on their picket lines with them, writing petitions. We've even had sympathetic media coverage because people know how important education is and how important education workers are. So fundthefuture.org.uk is our campaign. I'd recommend everybody go and take a look at it. We've got more calls to actions coming out next week. We really need the entire communities that are going to be affected by these cuts if we don't stop them coming. We're fighting tooth and nail on the ground for our members. We're on the third version now of a government bailout. That government bailout has come with all manner of strings attached that ask students to stop their niche activism. Black Lives Matter, decolonising the curriculum, and is trying to put limits on the abilities of academics to teach the modules that they think are important and cap degrees that they don't think lead to high salaries. So I'll wrap up there, but this is basically what we're doing. It's really important that you all get behind us. Please check out our social media because there's much more coming next week. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jo. Thank you. Well, we now have time for questions, and thank you for sending in so many wonderful questions. I can't see a way that we're going to get through them all, but I will try to touch on as many as possible and also cover as many different sort of areas as possible. So I've just asked the panelists to indicate to me if they particularly want to speak on a question, and I will try to bring you all in as we go through the questions, but I don't think we're going to have time for everyone to answer everyone, I'm afraid. So the first question we have is from Ali Chown, and Ali asks, COVID-19 has highlighted the importance of relationships to us all. It is recognised that the creative activities have been crucial to mental health and well-being of all of us during lockdown. How do panellists see this influencing approaches to education in the future? Mary.
I'm really glad that that question was asked, because I've been told to get something in which I didn't manage to get into my speech. But absolutely, relationships, it has shown how important relationships are and what happens when those relationships are disrupted. Many teachers, many support staff really concerned about their children and young people, concerned about what's happening to them, concerned that they're not having the normal relationship which seen them most days in school. So the National Education Union, we've said that when we come back to school, full school opening, we need to look at the 5 C's. We're talking about care, focusing on children and young people's well-being. Many of them will have been through very traumatic experiences, so we need to focus on caring for them. Focusing on the context for learning, why learners matter during the coronavirus, and starting from students' experiences and what have they learned from them. Some students will have had really positive experiences. They'll have learned new skills, new abilities. So we have to relearn what our students are doing and what they've learned and what they've missed. We have to be creative. This is a time when many children will, if they've been working at home, they will have learnt new things they will have learnt to be more independent. They will have learnt to be more creative themselves. So we have to be creative. And for those children who haven't been learning, the idea that they come back to school and we start immediately on catch-up and on fronted adverbials and on synthetic phonics, well, we need to do some of that. Well, I don't think you need fronted adverbials. I'm an English teacher and I didn't think they were important. But actually, we do need to be creative, and we need to, through that creativity, show that learning is really interesting and fun. We have to think about connections, you know, the connections that we've made during the coronavirus, and connections between schools and communities, and also the connections between subjects and actually community as well. What is the community? What's happened to the community in coronavirus? And how can we learn from what's happened? And how can we consider that in schools? So we've really focused on the 5 C's. Gavin Williamson, in a meeting I had with him on Tuesday, when I introduced that concept to him, said, no, there was only 1 C that children had to be focused on, and that was catch up. And that's the problem that we face.
Thank you, Mary. I see Gemma.
Just to quickly, absolutely agree with Mary. Speaking personally now, my eldest child is autistic. He's going into year 6. And alongside that, he has very high levels of varying anxiety disorders. What is absolutely key for children like him, children who have SEND, going back, is the relationships and rebuilding those relationships with his teachers and his new teachers. I've already been on the phone to his new teacher, his fantastic new teacher. And I am absolutely horrified that all they care about is catch up and rote learning and cramming, because it will destroy children like my son.
Thanks, Gemma. I think Kate.
Yes, thanks. A really good question, Ali. And I think you're right to talk about creativity. And in fact, that's always been downplayed in the rote learning curriculum that Mary and Gemma are talking about. It seems to me that catch-up is important. It is important that children, particularly disadvantaged children, make up lost ground. The attainment gap, even the DfE are admitting the attainment gap could widen by as much as 75% as a result of the time spent in lockdown. But catch-up isn't going to be achieved effectively if we're not attending to children's cultural needs, to their creative needs, and to their emotional needs. It's integral to effective learning and effective catching up that children feel secure, that they feel confident, and that they feel happy. And I am really dismayed to hear, Mary, that Gavin Williamson doesn't understand that learning doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in a context, and that context has to be about well-being. And that seems to me to be an absolute prerequisite of children being able to catch up. One of the things that we know is that the summer is being wasted. I'm not suggesting, and when I say that children should have been in class in the summer, or there should have been lots of tutoring. Absolutely not. But what there should have been was good funding for play, for arts and culture, for sports, and for community activity. The government hasn't attended to that at all. The usual 9 million for holiday activity won't get us more than 50,000 children out of the many millions that could be spending this summer preparing for their return to school, rebuilding their confidence and resilience. And the government simply hasn't bothered with that. It's only interested in a rote learning approach inside the classroom.
Thank you, Kate. I can see Joe wants to come in, and then I'll ask the next question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say really quickly that from a post-16 perspective, the obsession with the continuation of lecturing without any consideration for what that means, just shove it all online, shove it all online, has been so ill thought through, as if putting materials online and delivering them online is simple, as if there's not a pedagogical approach that, you know, people who work at the OU have developed for decades. And they've done this, you know, to try and assuage student complaints. But they've also done it at a time when they've been cutting staff in the thousands. And if what we're looking at in universities and potentially colleges is another 12 months of online learning, rather than giving universities and colleges the space to breathe by stepping in and ensuring the funding is there so we can have a jobs first recovery of the sector, people have been let go. So we don't have an all hands on deck situation. We have stressed out staff, not knowing if they need to keep their teaching for face-to-face because they don't know whether their employer is going to make them come back in the autumn, not knowing if they need to put online materials as well. And this is not good for students. It's not going to be good for the quality of the education that they're getting. It's not going to be good for anybody involved. And the problem at this moment is there isn't that space being given for staff to actually do creative things.
Thank you, Jo. And thank you all for answering that question, the importance of creative subjects, and it's brilliant. Thank you. The next question is from Jenny Smedley, and Jenny's got a question about bubbles. And if you've been working in education this year, you would never have expected in last September to have spent so much time talking about bubbles, but we have. So Jenny asks, would a year group bubble in a primary school consisting of 8 adults, where 2 of those adults also cover PPA, that's planning and preparation, in other classes outside of the bubble be appropriate? I think that's quite a specific question around an individual bubble, but just generally, maybe we can widen that out in terms of the government's approach and some of the guidance that's come out, or the lack of it. So Patrick.
Yeah, well, I never thought for one moment that I would spend so much of my time talking about the very concept of a bubble. Beyond those that would make me smile in the open air, to be perfectly honest. And frankly, we are in danger of allowing certain ideas. I mean, they're barely concepts. To creep into the way in which we do things and the way in which we manage for a good educational provision, but also safe educational provision. And it's very clear, certainly with the latter iteration of the government's guidance for schools, that a bubble, frankly, is not a valid concept. It's a highly flawed concept. And actually, where schools are seeking to manage on the basis of educational bubbles, that can be quite difficult, both for safety, but also for quality of education provision. Schools were not built for educational bubbles. They were built, insofar as you can talk about them being built and designed, to support teaching and learning. And the movement of children within schools is critically important to that. We've just been talking about relationships. What does a relationship actually mean if I can't escape the bubble that I've been placed in? What impact might that have on a child's sense of self and connectedness to their, the environment in which they're actually learning? There's a big challenge for schools. And I have to say it's a big challenge this summer. And Kate said it earlier about how outrageous it was that the Department for Education published its guidance on the 2nd of July in the expectation that schools would be ready to reopen fully at the beginning of September, because most schools are now working hard over the course of the summer holiday in order to prepare for that. The big challenge for schools is the challenge of safety. It's a challenge for those working in schools. It's a challenge for parents as well. And the government has not got anywhere near the mark of persuading most parents about the safety of returning their children to school. And frankly, fictional concepts such as the educational bubble don't help. What helps is to have clarity about the precise activities that need to take place in order to keep classrooms safe. It means being clear about what physical distancing will actually mean and what it needs to mean, and whether indeed schools have got the capacity to bring all children in at the same time. It means being clear about cleaning routines within schools. All of these things are going to matter and matter immensely. I mean, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that the government's concept of bubbles is the same concept which has driven the relaxation of lockdown. It's the same concept which has led to the peaking of the virus in certain towns and cities around the country. Well, what we don't want to be seeing is the full reopening of schools in September and seeing that driving a second wave in respect of the transmission of the coronavirus. It's a bad concept. The government has been put to proof on it and has not provided the evidence underpinning that. Schools are going to have to organise for safety to protect children, the workforce, but also to reassure parents and communities.
Thank you, Patrick. Mary.
Just really quickly, because Patrick, I mean, the particular question that has been put, it's much better if that questioner asks that question directly to her union, because it's really, really specific, and I don't want to give the answer on general guidance. But the one thing I would say is that I agree with Patrick. I think that the return to school will be fragile, because basically what the government's hoping for is it's hoping for the best. There's no plan B. There's no plan B if there needs to be quite widespread further lockdowns. The plan, and we wrote to Boris Johnson on the 10th of June and said, right, you need an education recovery plan, so you need to look at expanding the school site, hiring all the newly qualified teachers who don't have jobs, hiring supply teachers, cutting class sizes. You need to look at proper plans for blended learning, so that if children and young people do need to learn at home, again, we've got a national system for blended learning. And the Labour Party has been talking about this. When I listened to Keir Starmer talking about Nightingale schools, talking about proper plans for blended learning, talking about getting more staff into schools so you can keep those groups smaller. And the advice from the Welsh Technical Advisory Group for the Welsh Assembly Government is that secondary schools, the contacts of secondary school pupils should be about 10 contacts. Now, that is obviously going to be ignored both by the Welsh Assembly Government. It's certainly going to be ignored by our government, where in secondary, you can have bubbles of up to 240 students, which is a whole year group. And whereas the scientific evidence seems to be now emerging that primary children transmit far less, that's a WHO guidance saying that, and that there was an guidance put in the Welsh Assembly Government's guidance as well. Sage hasn't said that, but that seems to be starting to emerge. There is no such emerging evidence for secondary school pupils. So the situation there is really, really problematic, and we expect to see a fragile and fractured return to school.
Thank you, Mary. I'm conscious of the time, but we have my tech people are telling me that we may be able to go slightly over, so I'm hoping that our panelists will be able to stay with us. We've got so many questions, and we've got over 90 people just on Zoom, so it's fantastic to have so many people with us. So it's a brilliant opportunity to get some of these questions answered and a response from you all. So the next question is from James Whitting, and James asks, how far do you think, do panel members think that the government in its plans for reopening in September is just trying to prevent its educational ideology on testing, pedagogy, knowledge-based curriculum from being undermined at the expense of the safety of staff and pupil well-being? Kate.
Well, James, far be it from me to give any credit to a Conservative government, but I do think that is a bit harsh. I think there is a recognition that education is important, and that teachers fulfill a very important professional role in educating children and young people and adult learners, which can't be replaced by what has been happening with the best will in the world in the home. And particularly for more disadvantaged children, some of whom are getting very, very little access to the kind of resources they need for good quality learning. So I'll give them some credit. They've acknowledged that our education settings actually do a very good job, that they're packed out with really highly qualified, highly skilled professionals who know how to teach, how to develop students' learning, how to enable them to reach their full potential. Sadly, they've of course set up an education system, as you rightly say, with a set of structures in terms of content of curriculum, evaluation and assessment, inspection and incentive, which is totally against the kind of rich learning that we believe would be in the best interests of every individual and in the best interests of our country as a whole. And I do agree with you, James, that in fact, in some ways, they're reinforcing some of those prejudices. I think you see that particularly, for example, as Joe rightly said a few moments ago, in relation to what they've said about the university sector over the last few days, and the way in which, to get any sort of government support, universities are really going to have to abandon what they're there to do, which is to open minds and give people the chance to explore new thinking and new ideas in the broadest possible way that they can. I think it's interesting, having said that, that some things are changing. They're changing out of necessity. For example, the Ofsted not inspections that will take place over the autumn, or the fact that there will be different assessment models to replace GCSE and A-level over this summer. I don't naively assume that that means that the government is making those changes in ways that we might necessarily like and welcome. But I think it's an opportunity for us to look at what is good and bad about a different kind of practice. And so I think we need to seize that opportunity. And I particularly liked what I think both Gemma and Mary talked about earlier. We've got a rich set of sources to go to assess what works and what doesn't. I'm very fond of academic research and evidence. I'm a complete junkie for it. I can assure you I'll be reading lots of that over the time I spend in this role. We have to listen to education professionals, people on the front line. We have to listen to learners. And you as educational professionals in trade unions have so much to offer to this learning and reimagining of what's good and what works in education and what hasn't. And I think we should say to the government, all right, you believe in a particular form of learning, we believe it's flawed. Now let's try and work on what has worked better over the last few months and see how we can develop our different kind of model and really build the confidence of staff, of students and of their families in a better kind of learning.
Thank you, Kate. Mary and then Patrick. Mary.
I think that's what Kate's just said is right. I think there is an opportunity to do things differently, but we have to recognise that the government is hell-bent on trying to get back to the old normal as quickly as possible. So the changes that Ofqual want to make to our GCSEs and A-levels are the minimum that they can make. You know, they're actually taking away all the best bits, all the nice bits, speaking and listening in English, practical work in science, and hold the exams 3 weeks later and see if you can cram as much in. So, you know, and we're dealing with a government, frankly, with government ministers who, frankly, either have that position ideologically that really what you've got to do is rote learning and exams, or have it through ignorance. So Gavin Williamson said on Tuesday, well, of course, we know that exams are the best way, the most unbiased way to assess students. And when I said, well, you do know that in every 1 in 4 exam papers will be marked wrong. And you do know that disproportionately falls upon black students and working class students. You know, the research is quite clear on that. And as soon as you mention the word research, you can see the lights going out all over Europe. It's just not, it's not something that he's interested in. So we have to keep making the points. We have to keep fighting for what we want. But what we really want, what we really need is a Labour government who will really look seriously and start making the bold decisions that need to be made to get our education system fit for a 21st century. We can do something in this crisis, but we need a change of political direction in education so that we can do things better, so that we can build that better.
Thank you, Mary. Patrick.
Yeah, thanks very much, Hannah. And I mean, just pick up on both points that Kate and Mary have just been saying, because I think, you know, what I said earlier about the government's plan, and that was kind of very central to the question here. Government's plan for reopening, regardless of what its purpose is, its ideological purpose, but does it have a plan? Because I don't believe it does have a plan. Insofar as it had a plan, it was its 2010-11 plan about what education is for and how it should be organised. Its objective, its aim, is to get children back into school in large numbers, or indeed entirely, from the start of September, by hook or by crook. And if that means punishing parents then so be it. But that's as far as the plan goes. They've published guidance, but not a plan. And we need a plan. And I think that, you know, with greatest of respect, I mean, of course, you know, if we have a Labour government, maybe we'll have a government that's prepared to sit and engage with the teaching profession and with trade unions and so on. And that's vitally important. But in the here and now, we've got to find a way of getting governments to move on a plan which is actually going to deliver educational justice for all children and young people. And I think that starts with getting children back into school. I mean, you know, it's certainly not going to be coming from me to suggest that the best place for children is going to be at home. The best place for children is going to be in school, to be taught by qualified teachers. That's what we need, and particularly for those children who are the most disadvantaged. So that's crucially important. But how's the government going to ensure that that happens? And how's the government going to ensure that those children are supported to reconnect with their learning? And I don't think that is helped in terms of answering that question by insisting on a return to the old modes of operation, particularly on accountability. And that point's been raised by a number of panelists this afternoon. To teach to the test is bad enough, but then to use the results of tests for the purposes of making, frankly, perverse judgments about how schools are performing and how teachers are performing is quite honestly outrageous. And what we need to be focusing on as part of this planned return is, what does accountability for the next academic year actually look like? The government hasn't made any final decisions on the question of school performance tables. We need to take that window of opportunity. And I think, Gemma, you raised it earlier in your contribution, take the window of opportunity to seek to press the government on a more sensitive, humane, if you will, approach to holding schools to account. Because the last thing that teachers and schools need, and the last thing, frankly, that children and young people need, is to be judged unfairly, you know, in the wake of a global pandemic.
Thank you, Patrick. I know that Joe is going to come in next. Joe, just I've got a question from Laura Wright, who's an FE and HE music specialist in particular. So I thought that you may welcome this question. She's talking about the total lack of government guidance that has been lacking. That's been entirely lacking in the FE sector, and just wondered if you could comment on that as well.
Yeah, I'll comment on that first. It's been atrocious. I mean, as a union, we've really had to step in and do risk assessments at pretty much every further education college. The AOC have actually been quite helpful, but the government, and this is the same with HE, it's like they just do not understand these workplaces. They don't understand the spaces. They don't understand how many people go up and down a corridor, into a classroom, out of a classroom. You know, in universities, you can have hundreds of people waiting to get in one room at 10 to the hour. They, you know, and the health and safety aspects of this in any kind of return have just been completely substandard. To link this back to the previous question, you know, I find very little evidence that the health and safety of staff have been driving a government agenda to get colleges back and to get universities back. You know, Boris Johnson was saying all universities should be back in September, where at the same time they're putting forward a bailout that is ideologically driven, that is about reducing the diversity and the depth and strength of university courses, that is about pitting HE and FE against each other and really only valuing education as something that delivers labour market training. So I don't know if I'd go as far as the person who asked the first question, but I think I just do not see much evidence that they're not using this crisis to push through an ideological agenda, both for FE when it comes to kind of skills and training and employability, and HE when it's to denigrate subjects that they either don't like or presumably don't think working class people should get a chance to study. And if you're lucky enough to go to a school where you learn Latin, then you might go to university and do that or whatever. But so it's all just been completely substandard.
Thank you, Joe. I'm afraid we just haven't had time to get through all of the amazing questions that have come in, but thank you ever so much to everyone out there who sent them in, and all of the comments as well on the in the chat. I'm just going to give the panel just the opportunity to just round up for 1 or 2 minutes. 2 minutes is the absolute maximum. Just any final comments that you'd like to make, and I'll go in the same order that we started the session. So I'll ask Patrick first. Patrick.
Well, thanks for that, Hannah. I'm not going to take the 2 minutes. I think the panel has made some marvellous contributions this afternoon, and it's extremely welcome that Kate is part of that discussion, and we need to continue that discussion, because the fight for quality education and the educational entitlements of children and young people it isn't over, and we need to be part of that fight for reclaiming the right to high quality education for all children and young people. And if this crisis teaches us anything, it should be teaching us about the critical importance of education in the context of securing social cohesion, equality and social and economic justice for everyone. So I hope that we can continue this conversation, harness the energy in this virtual room in the interest of children and young people.
Thank you, Patrick. Gemma?
I don't have a lot more to say, just really encouraging to see the conversation centering around accountability and assessment, and the way the current system is frankly broken. And please just get behind our Drop Sats 2021 campaign, because we have a real chance of winning this.
Excellent, Gemma. Fantastic. Thank you. Kate?
A crisis is an opportunity to change things fundamentally and radically. Labour, after the Second World War, when we came into government, did that. We built the welfare state, and its legacy has transformed lives, including for me and my family. After the financial crash in 2007-8, I thought the same would happen again, that we would come back as a more equal, fairer society. And instead, we got a Conservative-led government and 10 years of appalling austerity. What's that taught me? Change doesn't happen by accident. It happens through determined leadership, commitment and belief, fundamentally based in our values. That means I want to be talking now about a different kind of education system for a different kind of future in a different kind of society, and for those ideas to become the norm. And I'm really delighted to be working with trade union colleagues to start to talk about that. I think it's an immensely exciting opportunity for us. Let's not let it slip through our fingers.
Thank you, Kate. Mary?
So I'll be really quick. Kate, we're ready to put our shoulders to the wheel for a vision of a new society and a new education system which will enable it to meet the needs of today's society, but the needs of the future. And the radical thinking has gone on there. And it's not throwing everything up in the air. It's not that you don't need to teach subjects. Subjects are the ways of organising knowledge in academic disciplines. You can't teach skills without knowledge. Otherwise you just teach them in the vacuum. But what we have to do is think much more intelligently about how we teach, what we teach, how children and young people learn, and what they need for the future, and synthesize the best of what we know and the best of what we need to know to prepare young people for life post-COVID and in the 21st century.
Thank you, Mary. And finally, Jo.
I'll be very quick. What I really want to say is that obviously the attacks from the government on post-16 education are huge, but that does not mean we have to accept them. You know, in the months that we've been in lockdown, this is the third iteration of the government's bailout for HE. We are inching them, but we are going to need everybody's help. So as energised as everybody was in getting behind, the campaigns that we saw around schools and returns earlier than they should have been, we need that now behind UCU's Fund the Future campaign. Next week, we're going to be releasing economic impact assessments of cities up and down the UK, what your city stands to lose, why you need to get behind the campaign, and why you really need to make the government understand that this is not just about, arts and humanities degrees in universities. It's about the role of universities and colleges in our communities, the life-changing opportunities that they provide. And we really, really need everyone to make that clear and not allow them to play this culture war game with us to denigrate in order to take away the funding that's needed. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jo. And just finally, thank you to everyone who's been watching and who's joined us today, be that on Facebook, YouTube or Zoom. And thank you to the Southwest TUC who have put on so much exciting material and events over this weekend. I'm now off to watch Skimity Hitches, which I wait for all year, so looking forward to that. But thank you finally to our brilliant panel members as well. It's been great to have you, and a really inspiring just over an hour. We'll sneak 10 minutes in. So, but thank you for staying with us and all of the contributions. And thank you to our tech team, Ines and Gary behind the scenes. It wouldn't happen without them. So thank you so much, everyone.